In a world ruled by power, status, and invisible chains, where a man could own another man and mercy was rare, while forgiveness was even rarer, a letter was written. Not a long letter, not a complicated letter, but one so powerful that it would echo through generations. This is a story of grace, of restoration, of a runaway and a master, and of a man in chains who dared to ask for something the world rarely gives mercy. In the heart of Rome, behind cold stone walls and iron bars that never slept, sat a man whose body was bound but whose spirit was not. Paul, once a persecutor driven by zeal, now a prisoner transformed by love, remained unshaken in purpose. Though confined in darkness, his voice carried light, and from that prison cell he began to write not to a crowd, not to a church alone, but to a man he knew deeply, a man named Philemon. Philemon was no stranger to faith. He was a believer whose life bore visible fruit, a man whose home had become a gathering place for others who followed Christ. His reputation was one of love and generosity, of faith that did not merely speak, but acted. Paul remembered him often, not out of obligation, but out of genuine gratitude, giving thanks for the way Philemon refreshed the hearts of others. Yet this letter was not simply written to commend him. It carried something heavier, something that would test the very faith Philemon lived by. Somewhere beyond the ink and parchment was another man, a man whose name carried tension, onesimus. Once a servant, now a fugitive, he had run from responsibility, from authority, perhaps even from guilt. In the eyes of society, he was nothing more than a runaway slave, a man deserving punishment if caught. But something unexpected happened along his journey. In a twist no one could have predicted, onesimus encountered Paul. It was not coincidence but providence that brought them together. In the most unlikely of places within prison walls, a meeting occurred that would alter the course of two lives. Paul did not see a criminal, he saw a soul. He listened, not with condemnation, but with compassion. And in that moment onesimus encountered something he had never known before grace. The man who had run away from his past now found himself confronted with a new identity. Through Paul he came to faith, and in that faith he was changed, not just outwardly but inwardly. The man who had once been considered useless was now described as useful, not only to Paul, but also to the very master he had fled. This transformation, however, created a dilemma. Grace had changed onesimus, but his past still remained unresolved. Paul knew that true restoration required more than personal change. It required reconciliation, and so Paul made a decision that would test all involved. He chose to send onesimus back. Not forced, not driven, but willingly returning to face the consequences of his past. Yet he would not send him empty-handed. He sent him with a letter that carried not only words but the weight of intercession. In that letter, Paul did not command Philemon, though he had the authority to do so. Instead, he appealed to him on the basis of love, choosing relationship over authority, invitation over obligation. He reminded Philemon of his faith, of the love he had shown to others, gently guiding him toward a greater expression of that same love. Then, carefully and deliberately, Paul introduced the heart of his request. He spoke of onesimus not as a servant, but as a son, a man who had become deeply valuable to him, someone he would have gladly kept if not for the need to do what was right. Paul's words carried both honesty and hope. He acknowledged the past, did not deny the wrong, yet reframed the situation through a different lens. Perhaps, he suggested, the separation had a purpose. Perhaps what was lost for a moment could now be restored forever, not as it once was, but transformed into something greater. No longer merely a servant, Onesimus could now be received as a brother. With this, the entire dynamic shifted. The relationship that had once been defined by ownership could now be redefined by love. Paul then made a statement that echoed far beyond the moment. If onesimus had wronged Philemon in any way, if there was any debt still owed, Paul himself would take responsibility. "Charge it to me," he wrote, offering to bear the cost personally. It was more than a practical solution. It was a reflection of the very message Paul lived to proclaim, a life laid down so another could be restored. As the letter was completed, its journey was only beginning. Onesimus now carried not just parchment, but the weight of possibility. With each step toward Philemon's house, the past pressed against him. Memories of escape, fear, and uncertainty followed closely behind. Yet something within him had changed. The man who once ran away was now walking back. That alone spoke of transformation. As he approached the place he had left behind, his heart wrestled between fear and faith. What if he was rejected? What if nothing had changed? But deeper still was another truth. He was no longer the same man who had fled. The grace he had received was now guiding him forward, step by step, toward whatever awaited him. Meanwhile, in Philemon's home, life continued as usual, yet something beneath the surface remained unresolved. The memory of onesimus had not fully faded. Though time had passed, the sense of loss and betrayal lingered quietly. Forgiveness had not yet been required, and therefore it had not yet been given. But that was about to change. When onesimus finally stood at the door and knocked, the moment arrived where past and present collided. Recognition came quickly, followed by silence heavy with meaning. No explanations were offered at first, only the simple truth that he had returned, and with him a letter from Paul. As Philemon took the letter into his hands, the atmosphere shifted. This was no ordinary message. As he began to read, the familiar tone of Paul's voice seemed to fill the room. Words of gratitude, reminders of faith, and affirmations of love laid the foundation. But gradually, the deeper purpose emerged. When onesimus' name was spoken within the letter, everything changed. The man standing before him was no longer described as merely a servant, but as a son, as someone transformed, as someone deeply valued. The request became clear, not just to accept him back, but to receive him as a brother. The tension in the room grew as the full weight of the appeal unfolded. Justice demanded one response, grace another. And in that moment, Philemon stood at a crossroads that would define not only his decision, but the authenticity of his faith. As the final lines of the letter settled into Philemon's heart, the room grew still, as though time itself paused to witness what would happen next. The words lingered in the air, an appeal not based on authority, but on love. Not demanding obedience, but inviting transformation. The message was clear, yet its implications were profound. If onesimus had wronged him, if there was any debt, any loss, any pain still unresolved, Paul had already offered to carry it. The responsibility had been transferred, the cost absorbed, the offense acknowledged yet covered. And now all that remained was a decision. Not one forced by law or expectation, but one drawn from the depths of Philemon's own heart. The eyes of those gathered rested quietly on him, not with pressure, but with anticipation. Onesimus stood nearby, silent and still, no longer hiding, no longer running, but fully present in the moment he once feared most. Within Philemon, a quiet battle unfolded, unseen yet deeply felt. Memories surfaced, moments of trust once shared, now fractured by absence and loss. The questions returned, uninvited, yet persistent. Why had onesimus left? What had truly been taken? What had been broken? These were not small matters, and they could not simply be dismissed. Justice had its voice, clear and firm, reminding him of what was deserved, what was right, what was fair. Yet another voice rose alongside it, softer but stronger, echoing truths he himself had believed and lived by. It reminded him of grace freely given, of forgiveness he himself had received, of a Savior who did not count wrongs but instead restored what was lost. These two voices did not cancel each other out. They stood in tension, demanding resolution. He looked again at onesimus, no longer seeing only the past, but also the present. The man before him was not the same as the one who had left. There was a difference that could not be ignored, something deeper than words could fully explain. It was in the posture, in the humility, in the absence of defense or excuse. Onesimus did not argue his case or plead for leniency. He simply stood there, willing to accept whatever would come. That alone spoke of change. And yet, it was not just onesimus who had been transformed. The letter in Philemon's hand was a mirror, reflecting his own faith back to him, asking a simple but piercing question. Would he live out what he claimed to believe? The silence stretched, not empty but full, carrying the weight of choice. Philemon inhaled slowly, as though gathering not just breath but resolve. He stepped forward, each movement deliberate, each step closing the distance, not only between himself and onesimus, but between justice and grace. Onesimus lowered his gaze, bracing himself, surrendering fully to the outcome. There was no resistance left, only trust fragile, yet real. Then, in a gesture that shifted everything, Philemon reached out, not with force, not with rejection, but with intention. His hand rested on onesimus, steady and present, an action that spoke before words were even formed. When Philemon finally spoke, his voice carried both truth and tenderness. He did not deny what had happened, nor did he pretend the past held no weight. The wrong was real, the loss undeniable. But he also recognized something greater unfolding, something that redefined the moment. The past, though true, was no longer the final word. What stood before him now was a man changed by grace, a man whom Paul himself called a son. And if Paul could see him that way, if God could work so deeply within him, then Philemon could no longer see him as he once did. The identity of slave dissolved in the presence of something far more powerful, the identity of brother. In that realization, the tension broke, not with force, but with release. The expectation of punishment gave way to the reality of forgiveness. Philemon's decision became clear, not because it was easy, but because it was true to the faith he carried. He chose not to hold the debt, not to demand repayment, not to define onesimus by his past. Instead, he let it go completely, allowing grace to do what justice alone never could, restore. The words spoken were simple, yet they carried immeasurable weight. Whatever had been owed was no longer counted. Whatever had been broken was no longer held against him. The account was cleared, not because it was forgotten, but because it was forgiven. Onesimus, overwhelmed by what he received, struggled to comprehend the depth of it. This was not what he expected, not what he deserved, and that made it all the more powerful. Grace, by its very nature, defied expectation. It could not be earned, could not be demanded, could not be repaid. It could only be received, and in receiving it, onesimus stepped fully into a new identity, one no longer defined by failure or escape, but by restoration and belonging. The embrace that followed was more than a gesture. It was a declaration. The distance between them was gone, replaced by something stronger than what had been lost. Those who witnessed the moment understood that they were seeing more than reconciliation between two individuals. They were seeing a living expression of the message they believed in, a tangible demonstration of what grace looks like when it is not just spoken, but lived. The story had moved beyond words on a page and into action, revealing the true power of the gospel. Love had chosen forgiveness. Mercy had overcome judgment. And in that choice, something new was created, not just for onesimus, but for everyone present. Far away, in a prison cell where chains still rested on his wrists, Paul waited without knowing the outcome, yet trusting in the work of God. His hope was not rooted in certainty, but in faith, believing that the same grace that transformed him, the same grace that reached onesimus, would also move in Philemon's heart. Though separated by distance, they were connected by something stronger, a shared faith that called them to live differently, to love deeply, and to forgive freely. The story did not end with that moment. It continued in the lives that followed. Onesimus remained not as he was, but as he had become restored, renewed, and welcomed as family. Philemon's home, already a place of faith, became a testimony of grace in action, a living reminder that true belief is revealed not in words alone, but in choices. And Paul, though still in chains, continued to write, to encourage, and to trust that even in confinement, God's purposes were being fulfilled. In the end, the letter to Philemon became more than correspondence. It became a reflection of a greater story, one that echoes through every generation. A story where debts are not merely settled, but carried by another, where the guilty are not simply excused, but transformed, where relationships broken by failure are restored by grace. It is a story that continues to ask the same question it posed then, when faced with the choice between holding on to what is owed and releasing it in love. What will we choose? And in that question lies the invitation, not just to understand grace, but to live it.